Assalamu alaikum. My name is Syeda Khan and I'm from Chicago. On behalf of Baqee Organization, I'd like to welcome Itrat Fatema to offer her perspective and shed some light on the issue. So Itrat, thank you so much for being here. First, I
Walaikum
wanted to talk,
salam. Thank you
first,
so
I
much
want,
for having me.
thank you. First, I wanted to talk about the situation of the gravesite. So in your own words, how would you describe the conditions at the gravesite currently?
The graveyard of Al-Baqi that was once looked after with such splendor and maintained with such high respect is now the is now reduced to a small mound of dust, and the only signs of the four imams of ours is a small piece of stone which has their names on it. As well as this, there is a organization at present called Amr bil Ma'ruf wa Nahy anil Munkar at the gates of Al-Baqi, which stops travelers from visiting the graves of Al-Baqi and sitting next to them. You can only look at the graves from really far away. And this is extremely saddening for Shias across the world because those imams are of such a high value to us, and to only be able to see them from such a far, far away had all Shias, I believe, across the world.
Right. They're not given nearly as much significance as they should be receiving when they're in these grave sites. I mean, they're not even valued to as much as regard as Shias give to the members that are buried there. They're treated as if they're just not even human graves, but just as if it was even lower than that, which is beyond upsetting. And as well, I wanted to ask you, like, in what ways are you personally connected to Jannatul Baqee? I know everyone has their own story about the people who are buried there, and what they feel about their status with either visiting the graveyard or the distinguished leaders that are buried there. So I wanted to ask what your personal connections are to Jannatul Baqee.
So, growing up Shia and having the opportunity to go to the majalis of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, and being able to go to Iraq and go to his shrine, and seeing the countless organizations that are working towards Imam Hussein alayhi salam, like whoishussein.org, and seeing the annual Arba'in procession from Najaf to Karbala every year, really it saddens me the when you think about the oppression that Imam Hassan alayhi salam and the rest of the Imams in Baqiyya go through, because it really is a privilege to be able to sit and sit in the haram of Imam Hussein alayhi salam in such a big shrine, and sit in the haram of Imam Ali alayhi salam, when in Baqi there is a small space there's a small space with just a small stone for the four imams in Baqi, and it just makes you think. And for me personally, it just made me think that we really have neglected the imams in Baqi, and also usually it's more difficult to connect with imams that you cannot physically go towards, because as we said that there is no way that you can connect to the imams in person. You can only talk to them from far away, and even then you're stopped after a certain amount of time. So it's harder to connect in that way, I understand, but I really, in this pandemic and this wave of loneliness and isolation that people across the world have faced, it's made it much more easier to sympathize and to seek close proximity to their Imams and Baqi, because for nearly a century they have been isolated and under the oppressive rule of the Saudi regime, and away from all of their lovers, and away from all of the people that love them and they love. And I think that made me connect more to the Imams in Baqiyya just by realizing the privilege that we have by connecting to the other Imams and feeling a sense of neglect towards the respectable Imams.
Right. It's a lot of burden on the individual where we feel like, we're not doing enough, and in fighting for Baqee, but also not doing enough in sense of we can't even go and visit it, even if we wanted to, because some of these matters just aren't in our hands. And so that leads me to my next question about obviously the dictatorship and the oppressive power over here is, the Saudi Arabian government. So I want to talk more about the systemic flaws within that government and, how they operate this way against this consistent oppression towards Shia Muslims and their Islamic leaders. So, what systemic flaws, like, in your own words, lie within the Saudi Arabian government that has caused such a disregard for Muslim and Shia leaders alike?
Yeah, so the Saudi regime in and by itself is flawed simply because it is built upon the ideologies of Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Abdul Wahhab. The Wahhabi ideology in itself is extremely flawed, especially for Shias. We are targeted across the world because of these extremist ideologies. Um, in 1744, Muhammad bin Saud, the founder of the Saudi royal family, um, made a theologian pact with Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, the founder of Wahhabism, known as the Saudi Wahhabi Pact. This essentially built the foundations of the modern day Saudi government and Saudi royal family. It essentially creates hatred within the different Islamic schools, from especially from Shia to Wahhabis, and that has been a root cause for the oppression that has been faced in Baqee and in across Saudi as a whole. The ideology, especially when it comes to graves, looks at the worship, looks at the building upon of graves and the um, visiting of graves as shirk, which is something that is not part of monotheism. And this ideology starts by creating hatred within a person's heart, basically.
Right.
And that hatred leads eventually towards a governmental a governmental a governmental policy, we should say, a governmental policy which basically, as we see in Baqi, has led to the demolition.
Right. Yeah, I know that a lot of these, the matters that have taken place on this beloved graveyard are out of our hands. But the Jannatul Baqee organization and the project of rebuilding Baqee with this organization, inshallah, will lead to many successes. So I wanted to ask, where do you see? I know it's hard for us as individuals to see, what the lasting impact or what the long-term solution is. But what are some of the successes of this that you see of this organization getting to?
Yeah, so I think the Muslim Ummah as a whole has given up on Baqi, but I really am inspired by this organization taking on the challenge and reigniting the flame that once was. I know Baqi has been an ongoing process for nearly a century now, and it's beginning to die out, especially in the Muslim Ummah as a whole. But for Shias, I think this organization will really help and be the forefront of the liberation of Baqi, especially if when we can gather international support on this organization and make it more accessible in different countries across the world, it would make it much more easier for different Shias and even non-Shias, hopefully, to connect with this organization. And I really think that this organization will achieve big things in terms of Baqi, especially at the rate which is growing right now. I think if we get more individuals to take initiative and stand up for Baqi as well as part of the organization, it would go much further.
Yeah, I do agree with that. The increased support for the Jannatul Baqee organization is just growing at this point. I mean, they have lots of standings that help them complete their mission. For example, the annual protest, which I know is virtual this year, but when it was in person, it would be a very monumental and a moving protest that would not just work to, instigate change and for, these Islamic heritage sites and all other heritage sites, but it also made a culture for Shia Muslims and other Muslims who decide to join on as well, knowing that this is something that we have to fight for and this is something that we can take action against. And obviously, when you have such a large organization around you, it's very easy to, attend those protests or attend those programs and, get caught up in that whirlwind and feel the change that you're making. However, a lot of people around the world don't have that opportunity, right? The Baqee organization is huge. It's huge. It's got UN standing. It has this protest that has had nationwide, even international coverage. Um, but even though there's so much out there about the Baqee organization, the best part of it, in for personally, is the impact on the individual that's participating in it. So when it's a little bit far from when the organization's events are far from other individuals, it can be hard for them to feel involved. So, what are some actions that you feel like individuals could take on their own if they aren't near either the Baqee organization or another existing organization that works in such a way?
So I think the basis of any movement is education, and every person should look towards educating themselves on Baqee, the entire situation, the first demolition, second demolition, the motives behind it, the current situation, etc. And after that, they should try and use their own personal, any kind of contacts that they have. Social media accounts go like a long way, especially in this age.
Right.
Using the hashtag rebuild Baqee is would do a massive amount in favor of this movement, as it's already a well-established hashtag. And by using one hashtag across all different posts, it can be searched up and it can have a huge mass information under one hashtag, which would create a lot more impact than everyone using different kinds of um, hashtags, and it creates a unified form. Also, if people have the ability and like the contact to create and start protests in their own cities, as we've seen with people organizing last minute Palestine rallies in the last few days, it would be really beneficial for people to organize al Baqi rallies in their cities, maybe using the local Muslim community or just their Shia community or even non Shia community. Anything really helps. Social media and using hashtags and organizing real protests work would work really well.
Right. I completely agree that, taking the one step from the individual is going to help, inshallah, the overall long-term process of the Shia Ummah and the Muslim Ummah as a whole is just us taking that first step. No matter what it is, it could be as big as we want it, but even the smallest action is in the palm of our hands. And so talking about the impact of and the willingness of individuals, I wanted to ask you about your personal goals. So what personal goals do you have to fulfill, either with the site or goals that you have that are influenced by the respected imams and others that are buried there?
The main goal that I think I and probably everyone else that works for Baqi has is to always fight for the oppressed in any way that is possible. And I think we can learn that from our Imams as well. Imam Zain al-Abidin alayhi salam, throughout his entire journey from Karbala to Kufa to Sham, he continually fought against Yazid, the oppressor of the time, in his when he was in prison. He still fought against him. He gave sermons in Kufa and Sham, and I think we really learned that from all the Imams. Don't matter what trials they went through. Imam Hussein as well on the battlefield, Imam Hassan alayhi salam, they all taught us that the main goal is to always fight for the oppressed people, be that yourself that is oppressed or other people that are oppressed. It's your duty to work towards them, help them. And I think with Baqee, we see that our own Shia in Saudi as a whole are oppressed, and it's a wider global movement for Shias. But at the same time, our own Imams are oppressed by being under a um, terrorist regime. And the Imams have always taught us to fight against oppression. It would be unjust to now leave them when they are under the oppression.
Right. Yeah, I truly do believe that as well. You know, giving a voice to the voiceless is one of the most impactful things an individual can do to take action on their own. And I know that you had talked about, you know, Imam Zain al-Abidin, and how he always, you know, even though when he was imprisoned, he still fought. And just like that, we need to make sure that even when we're given the utmost freedom, we still should be fighting no matter what, especially for those that don't have a chance to fight for themselves. And I know you brought up his story, so I also wanted to ask about maybe someone else that is also buried at the heritage site that you feel a personal connection to. And even if you have, like, you know, a favorite story or teaching from them, why don't you go ahead and share about that?
So one of the great personalities buried in Baqi is Imam Hassan alayhi salam, the third Holy Imam. And he fought against oppression, as did all other Imams. But what makes him more unique is that he had his own he had members of his own army that were that were against his decisions, and they would call him the one who humiliated the mu'mineen. And I think that throughout this whole thing, that what really inspires me is that he remained patient. So despite the allegations that people put on him when he signed the peace treaty with Muawiyah, out of their ignorance, and he understood that it was out of their ignorance, and that's why he stayed patient. And I think it really reflects in our own lives as well. Sometimes we have our own family members or our friends that will get a bit rude sometimes if they didn't understand if they didn't understand the motive behind our own um if they didn't understand our reasonings or motives behind the decisions that we make. And it really just inspires you to be patient, and that you will face trials from people that are close to you, from your friends or family or just your loved ones, and that just you have to stay patient throughout that. Yeah.
Right, I completely agree. You know, staying patient is definitely one of the key virtues we can learn from our beloved Imam. And so another thing that I wanted to bring up was obviously the Jannatul Baqee organization works a lot with refounding, you know, the heritage site of Jannatul Baqee. But there's a principle to the entire demolition of, you know, such a grave site, is that it threatens basic you know, religious security or basic heritage rights of, you know, these grave sites. And so I wanted to ask, obviously this is not the first time that the Saudi government or barely any government has taken such an action to oppress people by going after, you know, religious rights or heritage rights. And I wanted to ask you if there are some other heritage sites that you know of, which are in areas where their religious freedom is threatened as well, because this isn't, you know, a new trend, as you know.
Yeah. So I would just like to say first that we shouldn't leave Baqi to be as a Shia thing or a Muslim thing. It really is just, like you said, a violation of religious freedoms, and anyone that has any basic value for human rights would understand that religious freedom is an essential part of many human beings' lives. And to see a group of people, let it be Shia or any other group of people, have their basic freedoms taken away from them should be a cause for concern for people all across the world. Um, and to answer your question, I'm sure everyone has been keeping up with the news lately and seen Palestine has been in the news quite a lot. And Al Aqsa Mosque recently was stormed by the Israeli Defense League, and they were attacking peaceful people that were praying on one of the most holiest nights of Ramadan, in the holiest month of the whole year. And Al-Aqsa is although it is part of East Jerusalem and legally should be allowed, Palestinians should be allowed to go into it as they will. Um, they have Al-Aqsa has been taken over by the Israelis, and Palestinians require a a permit or a permission from the government to go visit. And usually, when they apply for these permissions, they are denied by the government. And I think it's a really big cause for concern, and it should be for the whole world, as these are their basic religious freedoms to be able to enter the site that is within the proximity of their own houses and have to get a permit from the government that is occupying them and from the government that is ethnically cleansing them is unfair and is illegal under international law. But I also think that we should learn from the Palestinian people and their resistance, and we should apply that to Baqee, how even though Palestine, nearly 7 decades now, Palestine has been fighting for its liberation. Um,
Yeah.
Yet they haven't given up and they continue to fight with the same strength every single day. And as we've seen in the news, they continue to fight back even after the death and destruction amidst them. And I think we should really use that same strength for our own cause in Baqee and be inspired by them to continue fighting against the terrorist regime in Saudi.
Right. Yeah, especially like, you've seen these threatening acts um towards religious sites, whether it be a burial site like Jannatul Baqee or whether it be a masjid like Masjid al-Aqsa, done by oppressive governments, trying to gain control of these Muslims. And like I totally agree with the principle that you were bringing up in the beginning, that this isn't a Shia issue, right? Palestinians are majority Sunni population, and those that commonly visit the Jannatul Baqee burial site are mostly Shia. But this isn't, when at its root, this isn't a Shia or a Sunni or Muslim. It's not even, I would argue, it's not even a Muslim problem. It's a human rights problem. It's an ethical problem. It's a moral problem where governments should not under any circumstance be able to interfere with that level of like security of a human right. Religion is a very personal thing, and for a government or other entity to get involved is unjust, especially when acting in an oppressive manner. And so obviously we've seen this a lot in the Middle East, right? Palestine is known as a very war-torn country because of its illegal occupation of Israel there, and then Saudi Arabia just in general has an oppressive government that's in the middle of the Middle East that's become a war zone as well. But there are also these, oppressive acts now that we've been seeing taken, not just in these third world or war-torn countries, as well as some may say as in like Western countries as well, especially like as you've seen in France, we've seen an intense hatred against the Muslim faith. And not just actually Muslim faith, against any faith in France. And so with Saudi Arabia, it's also apparent that they have a certain hatred against, the Shia faith or other sects of Islam. And so how does the principle of, rebuilding this gravesite work to alleviate these kind of hate hate based hate-based ideologies resisting in, it doesn't reside in third world countries or first world countries. We can see it on all different sides. You can see it all over the world. So how do heritage sites and rebuilding them work to alleviate this tension that persists within countries all over the world?
Yeah, so Islamophobia, as we know, is rampant in Europe, in Belgium, in France, and I wouldn't say it's just Islamophobia. It's more of a hatred for religions as a whole. Any religion that is actively showing their religion and is not was not ideal in a secular society is a threat to the Western world. Um, but I think that what is really shown from fighting against the West as well as oppression in the Middle East is that oppression is oppression no matter where it takes place, and that wherever it takes place, we will fight back, and there will be people, there will be Muslims and non-Muslims and any people from other religions that will actually take up the challenge and fight against the Muslim ban in Belgium and France, and fight against the storming of Al-Aqsa and the forced evictions in Palestine, and fight against the Baqee, fight against the elite, the cause for Baqee.
Right.
But what I would also say is that it requires Muslim communities as a whole to step up together. The same way that Muslims are united in fighting against the West, Muslims should be united in fighting against oppression when it comes from Saudi Arabia, because there is no difference in the oppression except the oppressor. And when you make the stance for all Muslims to stand against the West, but then when it comes to the oppression from the Saudi Arabian government, a majority of the Muslim community is silent, and you only see a small minority speaking up. This really isn't going to help our cause, and it really doesn't help anyone that fights for human rights, because at the end of the day, what you're really showing is that oppression only matters if it comes from the West and if it comes from foreign white powers. But when it comes from your own Islamic government and so-called Islamic countries, then you want to keep quiet and not speak, perhaps in fear of who knows. But it's really important that the oppression faced in Baqee is recognized by Muslims across the world, and hopefully we can help free Baqee the same way that we have helped free other occupiers and other governments from terrorizing their Muslim population.
Right, I completely agree. And as soon as we take a stand and we work with, organizations just like Baqee, and really, as an individual, if we participate in such organizations and take part as, as an ummah as a whole, our influence and our impact is unmatched. And that's really where we need to stand with this on this issue. So before we leave, thank you so much, Sister Itrat, for all of your insight on this issue. And I hope that inshallah, the garden where our beloved leaders lies rebuilt again. Before we depart, do you have any closing thoughts that you'd like to share?
I would just like to add that it is our responsibility, every single Muslim, every single non-Muslim's duty, especially Shia's duty, to fight for Baqee, as we have our four holy imams and Sayyida Zahra alayhi salam, as well as countless other great personalities buried there. And I see the movement for Baqee, apart from this organization, it doesn't have the same kind of like strength as other movements, and as well as other Shia movements. We don't have the same kind of willingness to fight for Baqee the same way that we have willingness to go to Iraq, go to Arba'in. They're all part of the same cause, and I think it's very important to use your platform, use your social media accounts to spread awareness, use your contact to organize a procession, do something for Baqee, because Baqee for nearly a century has been under the oppressive Saudi regime, and we can't allow it to continue any longer. And inshallah, with everyone's combined efforts, we will liberate Baqee.
Exactly. This is not a Shia issue. It's not a Sunni issue. It's not a Saudi Arabian issue. This is an ethical and moral issue that we each need to take our own leadership on. And that's really what our responsibility is as a member of the Shia Ummah. We can't call ourselves members of the Shia Ummah because we go on ziyarat and we go on these wonderful trips and able to do, to be able to visit heritage sites when many of our scholars and our imams and our distinguished leaders are not getting the justice that they deserve. And it's not right for us to continue and continue with our lives as if there's nothing happening there. And we have to take any action, whether it's small or big, because at its root, it's our problem. It's our problem. We need to fix it. And that's where our responsibility really resides. So once again, thank you so much, Sister Itrat. And inshallah, until we meet again, but thank you so much. Allah Hafiz.
Thank you so much for having me. Khuda Hafiz.
Yeah.